You know, there's something about gas stations that makes my skin crawl. Maybe it's the fluorescent lights that buzz like dying insects, or the way they stand like lonely sentinels on empty highways, casting their sickly glow into the darkness. But I think it's something deeper than that. Gas stations are places where strangers meet strangers, where desperation drives people to stop in the middle of nowhere, where the normal rules of society feel suspended. I've always believed that. Certain places collect darkness like magnets collect metal shavings, and gas stations, they're some of the most powerful magnets I've ever encountered. They're crossroads where lives intersect for just a moment, where people are vulnerable, tired, and far from home. They're places where the thin veneer of civilization feels paper-thin. The stories I'm about to share with you aren't fiction, they're confessions, really. Testimonies from people who encountered something at a gas station that changed them forever. Something that made them question what they thought they knew about the world. Each person I spoke with had one thing in common. They all found something they weren't looking for, something that followed them home. What terrifies me most isn't the supernatural elements of these stories, it's how ordinary they start. How easily any of us could find ourselves in these situations. How thin the line really is between our safe, predictable world and something far more sinister. So I have to ask you this. When you're driving alone at night, and you see that gas station glowing in the distance, do you ever feel like it's watching you back? Before we dive into these stories, I need your help. If these tales resonate with you, if they make you think twice about that late-night gas station run, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories, and honestly, I think they need to be heard. Subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. We're building a community of people who understand that the world is stranger and darker than most people want to admit. And please, comment with your thoughts or your own experiences. I read every single comment, and some of the most chilling stories come from you, the listeners. This is Dr. Bonechill, and these are 3 true gas station horror stories that will make you reconsider every late-night stop you've ever made. Story 1. The Attendant's Gift. The first time I saw him, I thought he was just another night shift worker going through the motions. You know the type, dead eyes, mechanical movements, counting down the hours until dawn. It was past midnight, on a Tuesday, and I was driving back from my mother's funeral. The grief was still fresh, sitting in my chest like a lead weight, and I'd been driving for 6 hours straight through back roads, trying to avoid the interstate and the memories it held. The gas station appeared like a mirage in my headlights, one of those old-fashioned places with 2 pumps and a single attendant window. The neon sign flickered open 24 hours in electric blue, but half the letters were dark. As I pulled up to the pump, I noticed there were no other cars, no other signs of life except for the figure moving behind the bulletproof glass. The attendant was maybe 60, with deep lines carved into his face and gray hair that looked like it hadn't been combed in weeks. But his eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone working the graveyard shift at a roadside gas station. They followed me as I filled my tank, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When I went inside to pay, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh, clinical light. The place smelled of stale coffee and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers at a funeral. The attendant watched me approach the counter, his fingers drumming against the glass barrier between us. "Long night?" he asked, his voice gravelly from cigarettes and age. "Long week," I replied, sliding my credit card through the slot. That's when I noticed his hands. They were covered in small, neat scars, like he'd been cut by something sharp over and over again. He processed my payment in silence. But instead of handing me the receipt, he reached under the counter and pulled out a small paper bag. Inside was what looked like an old pocket watch, brass and tarnished, with an intricate design etched into the case. "This belonged to someone who stopped here about a year ago," he said, pushing the bag toward me. "Never came back for it, seems like. You might need it more than most." I started to protest, but he held up a scarred hand. "Take it. Some things are meant to find their way to the right person at the right time." There was something about his tone that made arguing feel impossible. The grief was making me vulnerable, I guess, open to gestures of kindness from strangers. I took the bag and left the weight of the watch heavy in my pocket as I drove the remaining 100 miles home. It wasn't until I was sitting in my empty apartment, surrounded by sympathy cards and wilted flowers, that I really looked at the watch. The etching on the case was more intricate than I'd first noticed, tiny figures dancing around the edge, their faces twisted in expressions that seemed to shift in the lamplight. The watch itself was stopped at 3:17, and no amount of winding, seemed to make it tick. I set it on my nightstand and forgot about it for a few days. But that's when the dreams started. At first they were just fragments, flashes of places I'd never been, faces I'd never seen, but they were so vivid, so real, that I'd wake up with the taste of strange food in my mouth or the smell of unfamiliar perfume on my clothes. In the dreams, I was always watching, always observing, like I was seeing through someone else's eyes. The watch began to feel heavier each night. I'd catch myself staring at it, mesmerized by the way the brass seemed to gleam despite its tarnish. The figures etched into the case appeared to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, dancing their eternal dance around the face of the stopped clock. After a week, the dreams became more focused. I was seeing the same person over and over, a woman with dark hair and sad eyes, going through the motions of a life that seemed hollow and desperate. I watched her eat breakfast alone in a kitchen with yellow walls. I watched her cry in her car outside a grocery store. I watched her write letters she never sent. The strange thing was, I began to care about her. This woman I'd never met, whose life I was witnessing like some cosmic voyeur, became more real to me than my own existence. I found myself thinking about her during the day, wondering if she was okay, hoping she would smile in the dreams. Then one night, I saw her die. It was sudden and violent, a car accident on a rain-slicked road. I felt her terror, her confusion, her desperate hope that someone would find her in time. I felt her life drain away as she sat trapped in twisted metal. And I woke up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat. That's when I noticed the watch had started ticking. The sound was soft, but insistent, marking time in my dark apartment like a heartbeat. The hands had moved to 3:18, advancing 1 minute from where they'd been frozen. I picked up the watch with trembling hands, and for just a moment, I could swear I felt warmth emanating from the brass case. The next day, I couldn't concentrate on anything. The woman from my dreams felt more real than the people I encountered in my waking life. I kept thinking about her yellow kitchen, her sad eyes, the way she'd written those letters with such desperate hope. I found myself driving aimlessly through the city, looking for yellow houses, searching for a woman I'd only seen in dreams. That's when I saw the obituary. Sarah Martinez, 34, died in a single-car accident on Highway 9. The photograph showed the same dark hair, the same sad eyes I'd been seeing in my dreams. The obituary mentioned she was survived by no one, no family, no close friends. Just like in my dreams, she'd been alone. I drove to the gas station that night, the watch heavy in my pocket. The same attendant was there, looking exactly as he had 2 weeks earlier. His scarred hands drummed against the counter as I approached. "You're back," he said, not sounding surprised. "The watch," I said, pulling it from my pocket. "It's showing me things. Dead people." He nodded slowly. "Sarah Martinez died about 2 weeks ago. She was a regular here, stopped every Friday night for gas and cigarettes. Quiet girl, kept to herself." "How did you know?" "Because she's not the first one you've seen, is she?" He was right. Over the past few nights, there had been others, brief glimpses of strangers living their final days, unaware that someone was watching through the lens of a cursed timepiece. An old man dying alone in a hospital bed, a teenager taking pills, in a bathroom stall, a mother of 3 falling asleep at the wheel. "Every person who's died in this county in the past year," the attendant said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The watch shows you their last days, makes you witness their final moments." "Why?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. "Because someone has to remember them. Someone has to see that they mattered, that their lives had meaning even if they died alone." He leaned closer to the bulletproof glass. "That's a heavy burden to carry, son. Not everyone can handle it." I wanted to give the watch back, to walk away and pretend none of this had happened. But as I held it, I thought about Sarah Martinez and her yellow kitchen, about the old man who'd died clutching a photograph of his dead wife, about the teenager who'd left a note no one would ever read. "What happens if I keep it?" I asked. "You become the keeper of their stories. You remember them when no one else will." His scarred hands pressed against the glass. "But you'll never have a peaceful night's sleep again. You'll carry their pain, their loneliness, their final moments. It changes you." I looked down at the watch. The hands had moved to 3:19, and if I don't, then they're forgotten, like they never existed at all. I stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of the watch in my hands. Through the fluorescent-lit window, I could see the attendant watching me with those sharp, knowing eyes. Finally, I slipped the watch back into my pocket. As I drove home, I realized I'd made my choice. That night, I dreamed of a young father who'd died in a construction accident, leaving behind a wife and 2 small children. I watched him play with his kids in a backyard with a wooden swing set. I watched him kiss his wife goodbye on his last morning. I watched him fall. The watch now reads 3:20. Every night it advances one more minute, and every night I witness another death. I've become the keeper of their stories, the guardian of their final moments. It's a burden that grows heavier with each passing day, but it's also a responsibility I can't abandon, because someone has to remember them. Someone has to see that they mattered. And now, every time I look at my own reflection, I see the same sharp, knowing eyes that the attendant had, the same weight of carrying other people's pain. I wonder if someday, when my own time comes, someone else will witness my final moments through the lens of that cursed watch. The worst part is, I hope they do. Story 2. The map that leads nowhere. I used to think I knew every road in this county. 23 years of driving the same routes to work, to the grocery store, to my ex-wife's house, to pick up the kids. I thought I had mapped out every shortcut, every back road, every possible way to get from point A to point B. That confidence, that sense of knowing where I belonged in the world, was something I took for granted. Until the night I bought a map that showed me places that shouldn't exist. It was 3 months after my divorce was finalized, and I was driving back from another awkward dinner with my kids. They were polite but distant, like they were talking to a stranger who happened to share their DNA. The whole evening had felt forced, artificial, and I found myself taking the long way home, dreading the empty apartment that awaited me. The gas station was one of those newer places with too many pumps and a convenience store that sold everything from motor oil to lottery tickets. But it was past 11 on a Wednesday night, and the parking lot was empty except for my car and a single 18-wheeler parked near the back. The fluorescent lights made everything look pale and sickly. I filled up and went inside to pay, my footsteps echoing in the sterile space. The cashier was a kid, maybe 19, with the kind of acne scars that suggested a rough adolescence. He was reading a paperback novel, something with a torn cover and yellowed pages. "Find everything okay?" he asked, without looking up. "Yeah, just gas." As he processed my payment, I noticed a display rack near the register filled with local maps and travel guides. Most of them were the standard tourist fare, discover historic downtown and scenic drives through wine country, but one caught my eye. It was older than the others, with a hand-drawn cover that showed winding roads disappearing into shadowy forests, local roads and hidden paths. The title read in faded letters, "Discover the routes others have forgotten." "How much for the map?" I asked, pointing to the display. The kid looked up from his book for the first time. "Oh, that old thing. Take it. Been trying to get rid of it for months. Previous owner left a whole box of them when he sold the place." He handed me the map along with my receipt, and I noticed his fingers were stained with what looked like ink. Dark blue, almost black, like he'd been writing with an old fountain pen. "Thanks," I said, but he was already back to his book. I didn't look at the map until I got home. My apartment felt especially empty that night, filled with the echoes of a life that had been dismantled piece by piece. I poured myself a whiskey and spread the map out on my kitchen table, expecting to see the familiar roads and landmarks I'd known my whole life. Instead, I found myself staring at something impossible. The map showed roads that didn't exist, streets that cut through areas I knew were solid forest, highways that curved around lakes I'd never seen. The paper felt old and brittle under my fingers, but the ink was vibrant, as if it had been drawn yesterday. Every line was precise. Every line was precise. Every curve deliberate, like someone had traced these routes with obsessive care. What disturbed me most were the notations scattered across the map. Tiny, handwritten notes in margins and corners. Sarah's last ride, March 17th, 23. Tommy disappeared here, the 2nd of August, 22. Don't stop at the station with the red roof, ever. I told myself it was just someone's idea of a joke, a piece of local folklore designed to sell to tourists looking for a thrill. But as I studied the map more closely, I began to recognize certain landmarks. The old water tower on Miller Road, the abandoned grain silo near the county line, the covered bridge that had been torn down 5 years ago but was still marked on this map as if it had never been destroyed. That's when I noticed the route, highlighted in red ink, that it started at my apartment complex and wound through a series of roads I'd never seen before, past landmarks that couldn't exist, and ended at a place marked simply as home. The word was written in different handwriting, shakier, more desperate, like someone had been trying to find their way back to something they'd lost. I should have thrown the map away then, should have crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash with the rest of the reminders of my old life. But something about it fascinated me. The careful detail, the mysterious notations, the way it seemed to promise secrets hidden just beyond the edge of the familiar world. The next night, I decided to follow the red route. It started normally enough. I left my apartment and followed the main road out of town, just as the map indicated. But after a few miles, the red line showed a turn onto a street I'd never noticed before, Pine Valley Road, according to the map, though I'd driven past this intersection hundreds of times and never seen a street sign. But there it was, partially hidden behind overgrown bushes, a weathered sign that read Pine Valley RD. The road itself was narrow and poorly maintained, cutting through dense forest that seemed to swallow my headlights. I drove slowly, following the red line on the map, which showed several more turns ahead. The strange thing was, every road on the map was exactly where it was supposed to be. Roads that shouldn't exist, marked with signs that looked like they'd been there for decades. I passed through a small town called Millbrook that wasn't on any official map, complete with a main street lined with dark storefronts and a church with a broken steeple, but there were no people, no lights in the windows, no signs of life except for the occasional car parked along the curb, covered in dust and rust as if they'd been abandoned for years. I kept driving, following the red line deeper into this impossible landscape. The map showed I was getting close to the destination marked home, but I had no idea what I would find there. The forest grew thicker, the road narrower, until I was driving through a tunnel of overhanging branches that scraped against my car's roof. Finally, the road opened into a small clearing, and I saw that it was my childhood home. Not a house that looked similar, but the actual house where I'd grown up 40 miles away in a different county. The same white siding, the same red brick chimney, the same oak tree in the front yard where I'd built a treehouse with my father. Even the old tire swing was still hanging from the lowest branch. But something was wrong. The house looked exactly as it had when I was 8 years old, before the additions and renovations my parents had made over the years. The windows glowed with warm yellow light, and I could see shadows moving inside, the shadows of people who had lived there decades ago. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the impossible sight. Through the front window, I could see my father as he'd been in 1987, sitting in his old recliner and reading the newspaper. My mother was moving around the kitchen, preparing dinner, her hair still the dark brown it had been before cancer took it away. And there, running through the living room, was a small boy with my face. 8 years old, innocent and happy, unaware that his parents would divorce when he was 12, that his father would die of a heart attack at 55, that his mother would follow 3 years later. I got out of the car and walked toward the house. The boy myself looked up and saw me through the window. For a moment, our eyes met across 40 years of time and pain. He smiled and waved, and I found myself waving back, tears streaming down my face. I reached for the front door, but as my hand touched the handle, everything began to fade. The house became translucent, like a photograph exposed to too much light. My family's voices grew distant, echoing as if they were calling from across a vast canyon. Within moments, I was standing alone in an empty clearing, surrounded by the skeletal remains of a foundation that had been abandoned for decades. The tire swing was gone. The oak tree was dead, its branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. I drove home in silence, the map beside me on the passenger seat. When I checked it again, the red route was gone. In its place was a new path, this one marked in blue ink, leading to a destination labeled "What You Lost." That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've followed dozens of routes marked on that map. I've driven through towns that exist only in memories, past landmarks that vanished years ago, to places that show me glimpses of the life I used to have. I've seen my ex-wife as she was on our wedding day, radiant and hopeful, before the fights and the silences and the slow death of love. I've watched my children as babies, before they learned to see me as a weekend obligation rather than a father. I've visited the apartment my parents shared when they were young and happy, before the weight of disappointment settled over their marriage like dust. Each journey shows me something. I've lost something I can never have again, and each time, I'm left standing in empty clearings or abandoned lots, surrounded by the ruins of what once was. The map keeps changing, adding new routes marked in different colors. Green paths that lead to might have been purple routes too. Second chances, black roads that simply end at destinations marked with question marks. I know I should stop following these impossible roads. I know they're leading me away from the life I still have, the possibility of building something new from the pieces of what's broken. But I can't stop. The map has become an addiction, promising glimpses of a world where my mistakes don't define me, where the people I've lost are still within reach. Sometimes, late at night, I stare at the map and wonder if the roads are leading me somewhere, or if I'm the one creating them, if my desperate need to find my way back to who I used to be is somehow drawing these paths into existence. The worst part is, I'm starting to see other people on these roads, lost souls like myself, driving through the night with maps that show them what they want to see. We pass each other sometimes, our headlights crossing in the darkness, and I can see the same desperate hope in their eyes. We're all following different routes, but we're all searching for the same thing, a way back to the people we used to be, the lives we used to have, the choices we wish we'd made differently. The map now shows over 100 different routes, spreading across the paper like a spider's web. Some lead to places I recognize, others to destinations I can't even imagine. But there's one route that's been there from the beginning, marked in faded black ink. It's labeled simply the end. I haven't followed that route yet. I'm afraid of what I might find there. But sometimes, when the weight of all these lost possibilities becomes too much to bear, I find myself studying that black line, tracing it with my finger, wondering if it leads to peace or just another empty clearing. The map is changing me, just like it changed whoever owned it before me. My fingers are starting to stain with ink, and I catch myself adding new notations in the margins. Little warnings for the next person who finds this cursed guide. Don't trust the happy memories. The people you see aren't really there. Every road leads back to the same place alone, but I keep driving these impossible routes, following a map that shows me everything I've lost and nothing I can keep. Because sometimes, for just a moment, I'm 8 years old again, waving at myself through a window that doesn't exist, remembering what it felt like to be home, even if that home is just another destination on a map that leads nowhere. Story 3. The Receipt That Never Ends. Civ. Always been the type of person who saves receipts. Not out of any particular organizational system, just a habit I picked up from my mother, who kept every scrap of paper that proved she'd spent money. My wallet was always thick with crumpled receipts from gas stations, grocery stores, restaurants, little paper testimonies to the mundane transactions that make up a life. I'd never thought a receipt could be dangerous. I never imagined that a simple piece of thermal paper could become a window into something so terrible that it would make me question everything. I thought I knew about the world. It started on a Thursday night in October. I was driving home from a work conference, exhausted and irritable after 2 days of corporate presentations and forced networking. The conference had been in the city, and I was taking the scenic route home through the mountains, trying to decompress before returning to my regular life. The gas station appeared around a bend, like something out of a postcard, one of those picturesque mountain stations with rustic wooden siding and a hand-painted sign that read Summit View Gas and Gifts. The kind of place that sold overpriced snacks to tourists and local honey in mason jars. It was nearly midnight, but the lights were on, and I needed gas for the final stretch home. The pumps were old-fashioned, the kind where you had to prepay inside. As I walked toward the building, I noticed how quiet it was. No traffic on the mountain road, no sounds from the forest that surrounded the station. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of wind through pine trees. The clerk was a woman in her 50s, with grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of weathered face that spoke of a life lived outdoors. She looked up from a crossword puzzle as I entered, her eyes sharp and alert despite the late hour. "Evening," she said, her voice carrying a slight mountain accent. "Cold one tonight." "Yeah, it is. Can I get $40 on pump too?" She processed my payment with practiced efficiency, but as she handed me the receipt, our fingers touched. For just a moment, her skin was ice cold, and I felt a strange jolt, like static electricity but somehow more personal. "You drive safe now," she said, her eyes lingering on my face. "These mountain roads can be tricky at night." I thanked her and left, stuffing the receipt into my wallet without looking at it. The drive home was uneventful, just winding roads, and the occasional glimpse of distant lights in the valley below. I arrived at my apartment around 1 in the morning, exhausted and ready for bed. It wasn't until the next morning that I looked at the receipt at first. It seemed normal enough. Summit View, gas and gifts. $40 for unleaded gasoline, the date and timestamp. But as I studied it more closely, I noticed something odd. Below the standard transaction information, there was an additional line of text. Transaction number 1 of ongoing series. Thank you for your participation. I stared at the receipt for a long time, trying to make sense of those words. Ongoing series. Participation in what? I'd never seen language like that on a gas station receipt before. I almost threw it away, but something made me fold it carefully and put it back in my wallet. The next few days passed normally. I went to work, came home, fell into the comfortable routine of my solitary life. But I found myself thinking about that receipt, about the strange wording and the cold touch of the clerk's fingers. There was something about the whole experience that felt unfinished, like a story that had been interrupted in the middle. On Monday, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The receipt had changed. The basic transaction information was the same, but now there was a second line below the first. Transaction number 2 of ongoing series. Subject observed at workplace. 1247 Corporate Drive, Cubicle 23B. Performance noted. Read the words over and over, my hand shaking. The address was correct. It was my office building. Cubicle 23B was exactly where I sat every day. But I hadn't made a second transaction. I hadn't been back to that gas station. So how could there be a second entry on the receipt? I called the gas station, but the number I found online just rang and rang. I tried looking it up on maps, but Summit View Gas and Gifts didn't appear in any search results. It was as if the station had never existed, but the receipt was real. I could feel it in my wallet, the thermal paper slightly warm against my fingers, and every day, it grew longer. Transaction number 3 appeared on Tuesday. Subject purchased lunch at Tony's Deli, 12:15 p.m., consumed turkey sandwich, potato chips, Diet Cola, sat alone, read news on phone for 23 minutes. Transaction number 4 on Wednesday. Subject stopped at traffic light, corner of Main and 5th, observed woman in red coat crossing street. Subject's heart rate increased. Memory accessed, similar coat, worn by college girlfriend, Jennifer Hayes. Each entry was impossibly detailed, describing not just my actions but my thoughts, my feelings, my most private moments. The receipt was somehow recording every aspect of my life, cataloging my existence with clinical precision. By Friday, the receipt had grown to nearly 2 feet long, covered in tiny print that documented every breath I took, every step I made, every fleeting thought that passed through my mind. I tried to throw it away, but it always reappeared in my wallet, longer than before, with new entries that showed whoever was watching me knew about my attempts to dispose of it. Transaction #47. Subject attempted to discard receipt in office. Wastebasket, 2:17 p.m. Retrieval noted. Subject exhibits signs of psychological distress. Recommend continued observation. The language was becoming more clinical, more detached. I was no longer a person making a simple gas purchase. I was a subject being studied, catalogued, analyzed. The receipt had become a record of my life being dissected by some unseen observer. I stopped sleeping every time I closed my eyes. I imagined someone watching me, taking notes, adding another transaction to the endless receipt. I started checking my wallet obsessively, watching the paper grow longer and more detailed with each passing hour. The entries began to include things I hadn't done yet. Transaction number 156. Subject will receive phone call from mother, 7:23 p.m. Will discuss father's health concerns. The subject will lie about own well-being. Transaction number 157. Subject will eat dinner alone while watching television. Will think about calling ex-girlfriend Sarah. Will decide against it for the 47th time this month. And the predictions were always correct. Every forecasted transaction came true exactly as described, as if my future was being written by whoever was compiling this impossible record. I tried to break the pattern. When the receipt predicted I would eat a sandwich at 12:30, I deliberately ate nothing. When it said I would take the usual route home, I drove a completely different way, but the entries just adapted. Transaction number 203. Subject attempted to disrupt PREDICTED behavior pattern by skipping lunch. Deviation noted and incorporated into ongoing analysis. Transaction number 204. Subject chose alternate route home via Maple Street. Rebellion against observation demonstrates continuing psychological engagement with process. No matter what I did, I couldn't escape the receipt's documentation. It grew longer every day, sometimes reaching the floor when I unfolded it completely. The paper never tore, never faded, just continued its relentless record of my existence. Weeks passed. The receipt began to include entries about my dreams, my subconscious thoughts, the memories I thought I'd forgotten. It knew about the time I'd cheated on a test in high school, about the lie I'd told my parents about where I was the night of my grandmother's death, about the secret fear I'd carried since childhood that I was fundamentally unlovable. Transaction #1247. Subject experiencing recurring dream about childhood home. Symbolic representation of desire to return to state of innocence. Subject unaware that innocence was lost at age 7 during incident with neighborhood cat. I had no memory of any incident with the cat, but the receipt's mention of it triggered something deep in my subconscious. Flashes of images I couldn't quite grasp, feelings of guilt and shame that had no clear source. The receipt was rewriting my understanding of myself, revealing secrets I'd hidden even from my own conscious mind. It was becoming a more complete record of who I was than my own memories. That's when I realized the truth. The receipt wasn't just documenting my life, it was stealing it. Every transaction, every entry, was taking something from me and adding it to some vast database of human experience. I was being harvested, one moment at a time, one thought at a time, one feeling at a time. The woman at the gas station hadn't been a clerk. She'd been a collector, gathering human data for purposes I couldn't begin to understand, and that cold touch when she'd handed me the receipt had been the moment. She'd marked me for collection. I tried to find others who might have experienced something similar. I posted on forums, reached out to paranormal investigators, called numbers, listed in the back of conspiracy theory magazines, but no one had ever heard of anything like what I was experiencing. Until I found Marcus. He responded to one of my online posts, saying he'd been dealing with something similar for 3 years. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, and I brought the receipt with me, now nearly 6 feet long and covered in thousands of transactions. Marcus was a thin, nervous man in his 40s, with a kind of hollow eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. He carried a briefcase that he clutched protectively against his chest. "You've only had it for a few months," he said after I'd told him my story. "I can tell by looking at you. You still look human." He opened his briefcase and pulled out what looked like a scroll, a receipt that had to be 20 feet long, covered in text so small it was barely readable. "This is mine," he said. "Started just like yours. A gas station in the middle of nowhere, a clerk who wasn't quite right, a receipt that wouldn't stop growing." I stared at the impossible length of paper. "How do you carry it all?" "I don't," he said. "Not anymore. It's become part of me. Every transaction is burned into my memory. I can recite every entry, every observation, every prediction. I've become a living database of my own existence." He looked at me with those hollow eyes, and I saw something that terrified me more than the receipt itself: resignation. "The worst part isn't the invasion of privacy," he continued. "It's the accuracy. The receipt knows you better than you know yourself. It shows you every flaw, every failure, every moment of weakness you've ever had. It strips away all the lies you tell yourself about who you are." "There has to be a way to stop it," I said. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. I thought so too. "I tried everything, burning it, shredding it, burying it, but it always comes back, longer than before. The only way to stop it is to stop being observed." "What does that mean?" "It means becoming invisible, disappearing so completely that there's nothing left to document." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some people choose to disappear permanently. Others find ways to become so ordinary, so unremarkable, that they stop being worth watching." I left that meeting more frightened than when I'd arrived. Marcus had been living with his receipt for 3 years, and it had hollowed him out, turned him into a ghost of himself. I could see my own future in his empty eyes, but I wasn't ready to give up. I wasn't ready to become invisible that night. I sat in my apartment and unfolded the receipt completely. It stretched from one end of my living room to the other, a paper river of documented existence. I read every entry, every observation, every prediction, and slowly, I began to understand what was happening to me. The receipt wasn't just documenting my life, it was creating a perfect copy of me on paper. Every thought, every feeling, every memory was being transferred from my mind to the thermal paper. I was being digitized, transformed from a living person into a data set. But here's the thing about being observed so completely, so intensely, you start to become aware of the observer. The receipt had been watching me for months, learning everything about me, but in doing so, it had also revealed things about itself. I could sense the presence behind the documentation now, something vast and hungry, feeding on human experience like a cosmic parasite. The gas station was just one of many collection points. The clerks just interfaces for something that existed beyond human understanding. But I could also sense its weakness. The observer was powerful, but it was also dependent on the very thing it was harvesting. It needed human consciousness to function, human experience to sustain itself, and that meant it was vulnerable to human unpredictability. The receipt had documented every pattern in my life, every habit, every predictable response, but it had also shown me something else: moments of genuine spontaneity, times when I'd acted in ways that surprised even myself. Those moments appeared as anomalies in the data, glitches in the pattern, I realized that the receipt wasn't just documenting my life, it was trying to control it. Every prediction was an attempt to lock me into a predetermined path, to make me so predictable that I could be completely absorbed into its database. But what if I refused to be predictable? What if I embraced the anomalies, the glitches, the moments of pure human chaos that no amount of observation could anticipate? I stood up, walked to my kitchen, and did something I'd never done before. I ate a jar of pickle juice while standing on one foot and reciting the alphabet backwards. It was absurd, meaningless, completely random. But as I did it, I felt something change. The receipt in my living room rustled, as if disturbed by an unexpected wind. When I checked it later, there was a new entry. Transaction number 2847. Subject behavior unpredictable. Data corrupted recalibrating. For the first time in months, I smiled. I'd found a way to fight back. Over the following weeks, I made unpredictability my religion. I changed my routine constantly, made decisions based on coin flips and random number generators, acted in ways that defied all logic and pattern. I became a walking chaos generator, a human glitch in the system that was trying to catalog me. The receipt began to show errors, contradictions, entries that made no sense. Transaction number 3156. Subjects simultaneously in 2 locations. Data integrity. Compromised. Transaction number 3157. Subject appears to be experiencing memories from unknown individual. Cross-contamination detected. I could feel the observer's frustration, its confusion as I became increasingly impossible to predict or understand. The receipt grew erratic, sometimes adding dozens of entries in a single day, other times remaining unchanged for hours. But I also felt something else, the presence pulling back, losing interest. I was becoming too chaotic to be useful data, too unpredictable to be worth harvesting. The observer was looking for other subjects, easier targets who followed predictable patterns. The receipt stopped growing. The entries became sporadic, then ceased altogether. After 6 months of relentless documentation, I was finally free. But freedom came with a price. I'd become addicted to unpredictability, unable to settle into any routine or pattern. I'd made myself invisible to the observer, but I'd also made myself invisible to the world. No one could get close to someone who changed constantly, who could never be relied upon to be the same person twice. I still carry the receipt in my wallet, though it hasn't changed in over a year. It's become a reminder of what I escaped, but also of what I lost. In fighting to remain human, I'd become something else, a creature of pure chaos, unobservable and ultimately unknowable. Sometimes I wonder if that's what the observer wanted all along, not to catalog human experience, but to force us to choose between being fully human and being free, to make us realize that true freedom means giving up the connections, the patterns, the predictable behaviors that make us recognizably human. The receipt lies quiet in my wallet now, its thermal paper faded but still readable. Thousands of transactions documenting a life that no longer exists, a person I can never be again. And sometimes, late at night, I take it out and read those entries, remembering what it felt like to be predictable, to be understood, to be human. But I never regret my choice, because there's something worse than being unknown, being completely known, catalogued, and filed away like a specimen in someone else's collection. The receipt taught me that the most terrifying thing about being observed isn't the invasion of privacy, it's the possibility that whoever is watching might understand you better than you understand yourself. And that understanding, that complete knowledge, is just another form of control. I'm free now, but I'm also alone in a way I never imagined possible. The receipt made me invisible to the observer, but it also made me invisible to everyone else. I exist in the spaces between patterns, in the moments of chaos that no one can predict or understand, and sometimes when I'm feeling particularly lonely, I find myself acting just a little bit predictably, just enough to feel human again. But I never let the pattern hold for long, because I know that somewhere out there, in gas stations and convenience stores and roadside shops, the observers are still watching, still collecting, still building their vast database of human experience. And I know that once you've been catalogued, once you've been reduced to a series of transactions on an endless receipt, you can never truly escape. You can only choose to become something else entirely, something unobservable, unknowable, and ultimately, alone. The receipt is still in my wallet. It will always be there, a reminder of the price of freedom and the cost of remaining human, in a world that wants to turn us all into data, but at least it's not growing anymore, at least for now. Conclusion: these stories, they change you, don't they? I can feel it in my own voice as I tell them, the way they settle into your bones and make you look at the world differently. Gas stations aren't just places to fuel up anymore. They're crossroads where the ordinary world meets something far stranger and more dangerous. I've been thinking about why these places seem to collect such darkness. Maybe it's because they're liminal spaces, places of transition where people are vulnerable, tired, and far from home. Maybe it's because they exist at the edges of civilization, where the rules we live by feel thinner, more fragile. Or maybe it's because they're places where we meet strangers, where we make transactions with people we'll never see again. And in those brief moments of connection, something can pass between us, a curse, a burden, a piece of ourselves that we never meant to give away. The pocket watch that forces you to witness death, the map that shows you everything you've lost, the receipt that documents every moment of your existence. These aren't just objects, they're mirrors, reflecting back our deepest fears and desires. They show us what we're really afraid of, being forgotten, being lost, being completely known. I want to thank you for listening to these stories, for taking this journey with me into the dark corners of human experience. If you found something that resonated with you, if these tales made you think twice about that late-night gas station run, please hit that like button and subscribe to Dr. Bonechill. We're building a community of people who understand that the world is stranger than most people want to admit. And please, share your own experiences in the comments. Some of the most chilling stories I've heard have come from listeners like you, people who've had their own encounters with the inexplicable, their own moments where the familiar world revealed something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. Remember, these gas stations are still out there, still waiting for the next traveler to stop for fuel and leave with something far more dangerous than they bargained for. The attendants are still working their shifts, the maps are still being sold, the receipts are still being printed, and somewhere out there, someone is getting ready to pull into a gas station late at night, thinking they're just making a simple transaction. They have no idea that they're about to become part of a story that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. So drive carefully out there. And if you ever find yourself at a gas station that doesn't quite feel right, if the attendant's eyes are too sharp or the clerk's fingers are too cold, if someone offers you something that seems too good to be true, maybe it's time to find a different place to fill up. This has been Dr. Bonechil, and these were 3 true gas station horror stories. Sleep well, if you can.